In the bitter winter of 1931, as the Great Depression gripped the nation, most American families were scraping together whatever they could, stretching a potato, reusing bacon grease, and praying for a warm meal. But behind the towering iron gates and grand stone walls of a Southern governor's mansion, the mood was strikingly different. Inside, candlelight flickered across polished mahogany tables. The scent of roasted meats and delicate herbs floated through the air. Silverware glinted under crystal chandeliers. Here, America's political and social elite gathered for lavish holiday suppers that defied the bleakness beyond their estate walls. But what exactly was served in these hidden halls of privilege? These weren't just meals. They were carefully orchestrated performances, culinary symbols of power, class, and resilience. Each dish was a nod to European tradition, Southern heritage, and the chef's artful mastery of ingredients that many Americans couldn't even dream of affording. Today, we're peeling back that velvet curtain and uncovering 16 forgotten high-class family recipes, once proudly served to governors, dignitaries, and even presidents. From truffled duck with citrus glaze to spiced plum pudding soaked in brandy, these recipes echo an era of stark contrasts, where elegance coexisted with poverty, and food told a deeper story than taste alone. In the hushed dining rooms of 1931's governor's mansions, the holiday meal didn't start with soup or salad. It began with a whisper of decadence: stuffed quail with chestnut puree. Quail, small, tender, and notoriously delicate, was not your everyday poultry. It was a mark of refinement, chosen for its elegance and subtle flavor. In high-class households, its preparation was a point of pride, and its presentation, pure theater. But the star wasn't just the bird. It was the chestnut puree, creamy, earthy, and labor-intensive. Chestnuts had to be roasted, peeled, simmered in cream, then sieved to velvet-smooth perfection. Combined with a touch of nutmeg and a whisper of Madeira wine, it was a taste that spoke of old-world luxury. The quail was often stuffed with a mix of herbed breadcrumbs, foie gras, and sometimes slivers of truffle, yes, truffle, then tied, browned in butter, and roasted just until the skin crisped and the meat barely pulled from the bone. For the families hosting governors and senators, this wasn't just food. It was a performance, a gesture of cultivated taste. And let's be honest, it was also a way to show that, even in times of national hardship, some tables remained untouched by hunger. Today, this dish has nearly vanished from American kitchens. But with the right care and respect for its roots, we can bring it back. A reminder that even in the harshest winters of history, there were places where refinement survived in the form of a golden-browned quail and a spoonful of chestnut cream. They shimmered on silver platters, nestled in their shells, bubbling under a cloak of green. Oysters Rockefeller à la Florentine, a dish so luxurious it could silence a room. Born in the grand halls of New Orleans in the late 1800s, Oysters Rockefeller was named not for its ingredients, but for its wealth. The buttery green topping was said to be rich enough for Rockefeller himself. But by 1931, this dish had evolved. In the governor's mansion holiday supper, it came with a Florentine twist, a nod to European sophistication. Spinach was added to the already decadent blend of herbs, breadcrumbs, butter, and Pernod or absinthe, deepening both the color and the flavor. Fresh oysters were shucked just before service, never a moment too early. Each one was nestled into its shell, topped with that lush emerald mixture, and broiled until the edges curled and the top turned golden. Served piping hot, they offered the perfect bite: briny, buttery, slightly anise-sweet, and absolutely unforgettable. For the elite holiday tables of 1931, this wasn't just a first course, it was a statement. An icebreaker. A performance on a plate. Guests would pause, savor, and know instantly that they were in the company of high taste and higher power. But somewhere along the line, this recipe was simplified. Or worse, forgotten. Boxed spinach replaced fresh. The ritual of shucking and broiling was deemed too much trouble. But it's time to bring back the real thing. The oysters that once lit up the richest tables during the darkest days of the Depression. This was not the kind of dish served quietly. Lobster thermidor with cognac cream was a declaration of wealth, of taste, and of European influence wrapped in American flair. It arrived at the holiday table like royalty, steaming, golden, nestled back into its own shell. Originating in Paris in the 1890s, lobster thermidor made its way across the Atlantic by the early 20th century, landing proudly in the private dining rooms of governors and upper-class families who wanted their guests to know this was not a time for restraint. By 1931, the American version was even bolder. The lobster was poached just until tender, then the meat pulled from the shell and folded into a luxurious cognac cream sauce, made with egg yolks, Dijon mustard, and heavy cream. A touch of nutmeg gave it warmth, while the cognac lent a flash of heat and sophistication. Then came the return, the filling carefully spooned back into the shell, topped with grated Gruyere or Parmesan, and broiled until bubbling and bronzed. The result? A showstopper. It wasn't just rich, it was performative. Served in gleaming trays over monogrammed linen, this was the centerpiece of the holiday seafood course. But make no mistake, this wasn't food for the faint of wallet. At a time when much of the country couldn't afford butter, these families poured cream into copper pans and flambéed lobster with imported spirits. And yet, today, most American kitchens wouldn't dare attempt it. Too complex. Too French. Too forgotten. But the recipe is still here, waiting, for anyone willing to honor the bold, buttery drama of a truly grand holiday past. It stood like a crown, literally. Crown roast of lamb with mint jelly wasn't just a meal. It was a monument. A centerpiece designed to command silence before the first bite was even taken. By 1931, at Governor's Mansion holiday suppers, this roast had become a symbol of prestige and tradition. 2 racks of lamb, expertly Frenched and curved into a perfect circle, were tied together, bone tips rising like the spires of a chapel. Inside the ring, a stuffing of breadcrumbs, wild mushrooms, and fresh herbs soaked up the juices. It roasted low and slow, perfuming the entire estate with the scent of rosemary, garlic, and rendered fat. The tips of each bone were dressed in crisp white paper frills, called chop hats, a final aristocratic touch borrowed straight from the Victorian table. But the real surprise sat on the side. Mint jelly. Vivid green, glistening like emerald glass, and made from real mint boiled with sugar and a hint of vinegar. To Depression-era families, lamb was almost unimaginable. But for America's political elite, the holidays demanded it, presented not just as food, but as theater. And when that roast was carried into the dining room, every head turned. Every guest leaned in. Because this dish didn't just feed the body, it fed the spectacle. Today, few even remember how this roast was made, much less why it mattered. But it did matter. It told guests, you are in the company of those who still feast, even while the world tightens its belt. A dish of power, beauty, and ceremony, and one that deserves a place on the table again. In a time when most Americans could barely afford a whole chicken, some families were roasting duck in orange liqueur. And not just any duck. This was duck à l'orange with glazed turnips, a French classic that graced the most exclusive tables of 1931 Governor's Mansion holiday suppers. The dish was as dramatic as it was delicate. A whole duck, dry-aged and air-dried, was seasoned simply, salt, pepper, maybe a touch of thyme, and then roasted until the skin turned lacquered, golden, and audibly crisp. But the real magic was in the sauce, a reduction of orange juice, duck stock, sugar, white wine vinegar, and a generous splash of Grand Marnier. Sweet, sour, and sharp, this sauce wasn't just a glaze. It was a signature. But while the duck dazzled, the glazed turnips grounded the plate. Turnips, humble, earthy, and often overlooked, were peeled, cut into perfect shapes, and simmered slowly in butter and sugar until tender and shining. Their slight bitterness balanced the sweetness of the orange sauce, creating a dish that danced between richness and restraint. For the political elite in 1931, this dish was more than a nod to French cuisine. It was a mark of international taste, a culinary flex of refinement and worldliness. It wasn't about excess. It was about elevation. Duck à l'orange told guests, you're not just being fed, you're being hosted. Today, we rarely see this dish done right. Too many shortcuts, too little patience. But once, it was the crown jewel of a winter feast, served on porcelain, under crystal light, to guests who expected nothing less. And now, nearly forgotten. Until today. It wasn't just beef. It was beef Wellington, wrapped, roasted, and regal. And in 1931, on a governor's holiday table, it arrived like a royal decree. This was the dish that stopped conversation. A center-cut beef tenderloin, seared to lock in its juices, then blanketed in a thin layer of duxelle, finely chopped mushrooms, shallots, herbs, and sometimes foie gras, all cooked down into a dark, savory paste. The entire masterpiece was then wrapped in puff pastry, brushed with egg yolk, scored by hand, and baked until golden, flaky, and crisp. The result? A knife sliced through buttercrisp pastry into tender, rosy meat and earthy filling, every layer designed for contrast and precision. But the luxury didn't stop there. Pooled around the Wellington was a truffle jus, a dark, glossy reduction of beef stock and wine, infused with shavings of black truffle. Earthy, aromatic, almost intoxicating. Just a spoonful turned the dish from exquisite to extraordinary. At the governor's mansion, this wasn't a weeknight roast. This was the centerpiece of a winter gala, a symbol of status, skill, and celebration. And yet, behind all that decadence was discipline. Timing had to be perfect. One mistake, soggy pastry, overcooked beef, under-reduced jus, and the illusion collapsed. That's why beef Wellington was only served when everything had to impress. Today, few dare to make it. But in 1931, it wasn't just cooked, it was performed. A testament to the host's power and the chef's perfectionism. This dish may have faded from most modern menus, but its legacy still whispers through history's dining halls. Wrapped in gold, sealed with flavor, and made to be remembered. In the glittering dining rooms of 1931's political elite, not every bird was a turkey. Some tables chose something rarer, wilder, and far more refined. Pheasant in champagne sauce. Once hunted on grand estates and served to guests of status, pheasant was the game bird of aristocracy. Leaner than chicken, more delicate than duck, it required finesse. Overcook it and it turned dry. Treat it right, and it melted like velvet on the tongue. But in this dish, the bird was only half the story. The other half came from a bottle, champagne. After roasting the pheasant, often basted with butter and fresh thyme, it was finished in a silken pan sauce made from reduced champagne, shallots, and veal stock. A touch of cream gave it body. Sometimes, a splash of cognac added warmth. The result? A sauce that shimmered, almost dancing on the plate. Effervescent, rich, and impossibly elegant. For the governors, judges, and dignitaries who gathered for holiday suppers in 1931, this dish wasn't just about flavor, it was a symbol. Pheasant said, "We hunt our own." Champagne said, "We spare no expense." It was tradition dressed in finery, rustic origins cloaked in refinement. And yet, like so many of that era's dishes, this one has vanished from modern tables. Because it demands patience. And ingredients most kitchens today no longer keep. But for those who dare to bring it back, pheasant in champagne sauce is more than a recipe. It's a relic of elegance. A whisper of the wild, softened by the sparkle of celebration. Proof that even in America's darkest years, some tables still shimmered. It didn't need truffles or imported game birds. But in the hands of a skilled 1931 chef, creamed celery and parsnip gratin became one of the most comforting and quietly luxurious dishes on the holiday table. At first glance, celery and parsnips might seem too humble for a governor's mansion. But that's the secret. This dish was never about rare ingredients. It was about what you did with them. Parsnips, with their natural sweetness and soft, nutty flavor, were peeled, sliced thin, and blanched until just tender. Celery, earthy, aromatic, often overlooked, was finely chopped and slowly cooked down in butter until silky and fragrant. Then came the indulgence. A rich bechamel sauce, made from cream, flour, and whole milk, infused with bay leaf and a pinch of white pepper. The celery and parsnips were folded into it, layered into a deep ceramic dish, and dusted with aged Gruyere or sharp white cheddar. It baked slowly, bubbling at the edges, until the top turned golden and crisp while the inside remained creamy and tender. At a 1931 holiday supper, this was the kind of dish that didn't fight for attention, but stole it anyway. It brought balance, mild and sweet against the richness of roasted meats and game. And it reminded guests that even the simplest things, when done right, could be extraordinary. Today, this gratin is all but forgotten. Celery has been demoted to stockpots, parsnips to farm stands. But once, together, they made something beautiful, something worthy of silver spoons and candlelight. And maybe they still can. Among silver trays of roasts and rich sauces, something green and whisper-light would often grace the 1931 holiday table. It was elegant, intentional. Asparagus tips with hollandaise foam. This wasn't a heavy, butter-drenched side. This was restraint, with polish. Only the top few inches of the asparagus spears were used, those tender, young tips with just the right snap and sweetness. Trimmed by hand, sorted by size, and blanched just enough to turn them a vivid green without losing their bite. And then came the showstopper, hollandaise, but reimagined. Not spooned thick from a saucepan, but whipped into a delicate foam, light, airy, and warm. It still held the essence of its roots, egg yolks, clarified butter, lemon juice. But here it was aerated, sometimes with the help of a copper whipping bowl or a secret squeeze from a siphon. The result? A golden cloud that melted the moment it touched the asparagus, bright, buttery, and tangy. This wasn't just garnish. This was culinary theater. A French technique, modernized even for 1931, and designed to make even vegetables feel luxurious. For elite families and political hosts, this dish offered contrast. After the weight of duck, lamb, and beef, asparagus with foam was a palate refresher, clean, refined, and just indulgent enough. And yet, today, the memory of it is gone. We've boiled the asparagus, forgotten the foam, reduced it to a side dish with no story. But back then it was a pause, a breath, a reminder that elegance doesn't always come loud. Sometimes, it's served in green silk and lemon gold. In a time when most families stretched a sack of potatoes to last the week, the governor's mansion turned them into velvet. Potatoes dauphinoise with nutmeg dust wasn't just a side dish, it was an event. Layered, slow-baked, and deeply indulgent. This dish came straight from French tradition, brought into American high society kitchens by European-trained chefs who understood something most still forget today. That the right technique could make even a potato taste like luxury. Thin slices of Yukon Gold or russet potatoes were arranged by hand, overlapping like shingles on a roof. Each layer was bathed in warm cream, infused with garlic, a hint of thyme, and just a whisper of nutmeg. Not too much, just enough to warm the back of the throat and lift the richness with its sweet spicy aroma. No shortcuts. No cheese piled high. This was about texture, the cream thickening slowly in the oven, the top turning golden and crisp while the inside remained soft and melting. But before it reached the table, the finishing touch, a final dusting of fresh nutmeg, grated tableside from a whole seed, a tiny gesture that felt almost ceremonial. For guests at the 1931 holiday table, this dish was comfort cloaked in elegance. It said, yes, we serve potatoes, but not like everyone else. Today, the dish survives in fragments, often drowned in cheese, microwaved, or mislabeled as scalloped. But the original? It was precision, patience, and pride. Potatoes, cream, and spice, simple. But when treated with reverence, unforgettable. That's what they knew back then. And it's what we're bringing back now. It arrived between courses, not as a filler, but as a palate cleanser. Pear salad with Roquefort and walnut oil. A dish that didn't boast, but knew exactly what it was. Refined, balanced, and quietly luxurious. In the grand dining rooms of 1931's governor's mansions, this salad was a strategic pause, served cool, crisp, and thoughtfully arranged. It wasn't about leafy greens or heavy dressings. It was about contrast, texture, temperature. Slices of perfectly ripe Bartlett or Anjou pears, chilled to just above room temperature, fanned across fine china. No sugar, no syrup, just the natural sweetness of the fruit. Then came the Roquefort, sharp, salty, and aged in the caves of southern France. Crumbled lightly over the pears, it offered a bracing counterpoint to their softness. Earthy, pungent, and unforgettable. And finally, the finish, a drizzle of cold-pressed walnut oil, imported when possible, pressed domestically when not. Its nutty aroma tied everything together, soaking just slightly into the fruit, never overwhelming it. Some versions added a sprinkle of cracked black pepper. Others? A few toasted walnuts for crunch. But in every version, one thing was clear. This salad wasn't an afterthought. It was precision, restraint, balance. At a time when most Americans could barely afford apples, this dish told a different story. Of connections to Europe. Of a chef who respected the ingredients. Of hosts who understood that luxury didn't always mean lavish. Today, we pile greens and drown them in dressing. But in 1931, one pear, one cheese, and one perfect oil was enough. A reminder, elegance is often found in the simple, when done just right. It was jewel red. Tart, sweet, and surprisingly modern. Cranberry relish with orange zest didn't sit quietly on the plate, it sparked. A flash of color. A punch of citrus. A moment of brightness in a sea of richness. Unlike the gelatinous cranberry molds that would come decades later, this version was fresh, and almost radical for its time. In the 1931 Governor's Mansion kitchen, whole cranberries were rinsed and sorted by hand, then simmered gently with sugar and a touch of water, just enough to burst their skins and release their ruby red juice. But then came the twist that set it apart. Fresh orange zest and segments were folded in, not cooked, but stirred through just before chilling. The orange brightened the mix, adding complexity and a fragrant lift that transformed the dish into something almost sparkling. A touch of grated ginger or clove might be added for depth, depending on the cook's style. But the essence remained the same, balance. Tartness, softened by sugar. Sweetness, sharpened by citrus. Freshness, standing tall between the heavier dishes. For high-class holiday tables, cranberry relish wasn't just a condiment. It was contrast. It cut through the richness of roasted meats, lifted the earthiness of root vegetables, and brought the meal back to center. And unlike imported game or truffle jus, this dish was accessible, even then. But in elite kitchens it was elevated, carefully plated, sometimes served in chilled crystal bowls, garnished with a single curl of orange peel. Today, we've buried it under canned shortcuts. But in 1931, it was a moment, small, vivid, unforgettable. A reminder that even the brightest sparkle can come from something wild and bitter. In the final act of a 1931 holiday supper at the Governor's Mansion, there was no towering cake. No icing roses. Just a quiet showstopper wrapped in golden bread and filled with spiced warmth. Apple charlotte with bourbon cream. This wasn't your grandmother's apple pie. This was French technique meeting American soul. And it was made to impress. At its heart, the dish was simple: apples, sugar, and spice. But the preparation was pure elegance. Sliced apples were gently stewed with brown sugar, cinnamon, a hint of lemon, and sometimes a splash of Calvados or bourbon for depth. The result? A rich, fragrant filling, soft but never mushy. But it was the shell that made the charlotte a work of art. Thin slices of stale white bread, buttered on one side, were pressed into a mold, lining the base and walls like edible wallpaper. Then came the apples. Then more buttered bread on top. Baked until the outside crisped and browned, the charlotte was then inverted onto a silver platter, revealing a golden dome, caramelized and steaming. But the final flourish made it unforgettable. Bourbon cream, a cloud of freshly whipped cream, lightly sweetened and kissed with just enough bourbon to make it whisper luxury and warmth in the same breath. Served warm, the charlotte cut clean, soft apples inside, a golden crust outside, and that airy cream melting into every bite. For the high society guests of 1931, it was the perfect ending, familiar, but elevated. Comforting, yet undeniably refined. Today, this dessert is almost unknown. But once, it was the grand finale. A reminder that the most memorable dishes don't shout. They linger. It didn't just end the meal. It arrived with ceremony. Steam rising. Silver glinting. Brandy lit a flame. Spiced plum pudding with hard sauce, the grand finale of a 1931 holiday supper steeped in tradition. Despite the name, there were rarely any plums. Plum was once the Old English word for dried fruits, raisins, currants, dates, figs, slowly stewed and spiced, bound together with breadcrumbs, suet, and dark molasses. This wasn't a quick dessert. It was made weeks in advance, sometimes even months, steamed slowly, then aged in a cool pantry where the flavors deepened over time. Clove, cinnamon, nutmeg, and black pepper added warmth. Brandy or stout gave it body. It was dense, rich, almost dark as mahogany. And when it was time to serve, it was reheated by steam and carried out whole. Poured over with warmed brandy, then lit on fire. The room would glow blue for a moment as the flames danced across the pudding's surface. That was the spectacle. But the soul of this dessert was the hard sauce, a blend of butter, powdered sugar, and a splash of brandy or rum whipped until thick and soft. Spoon it over a warm slice of pudding, and it melted into the crevices like cream over hot coals. For the high-class families of 1931, this wasn't just dessert. It was tradition. It was memory, passed down from English ancestors, perfected in American kitchens, and brought out only for the most special of nights. Today, it's nearly vanished from holiday tables. But once, it was fire, flavor, and family, all in one unforgettable dish.